Hello, this is part 7 of Who Runs This Place? Written constitutions versus political conventions and steering groups. Now, I've explained the whole raft of things to do with these subjects in my previous talks. But what is the causation of this problem? Well, the current political establishment, our industries, um, our our culture, our problems with terrorism come from two things. That's um, technology and our conception of our free will or our desires. Okay. Now, the current political establishment can trace its roots right back to the conceptions that come from banking, okay, but more importantly than that is the technology that changed the world from being a world that was based on the resources of the homogeneous resources of the country, i.e., coal or the the fuels and gases that it could get from its own territory, to being dependent on oil, and that dependence on oil just so happened to be by coincidence in a region of the world, the Middle East, full of irrational religious belief, and in a place where our basically we either fostered or we have a tradition of enmity between the West and the Middle East. Okay, now there's been cases of both um, Jewish organised crime and terrorism. I'm talking specifically of the effect of Jewish organised crime on teaching the Italian mafia um, in the United States when they were very powerful in the 1930s and 20s. But of course, they learned those ideas from the Anglo-Saxon mafias in the United States. And also the Jewish terrorist attack on the King David Hotel uh, in the by the Jewish organised crime group and terrorist group, the Haganah. Okay, now we're most familiar today with Islamic terrorism and Islamic organised crime, and of course I've detailed organised crime in Eastern Europe as well as being a major threat, and there is in China and in Japan as well, because there's no money laws against money laundering. Okay, but why is it that elites constantly, and organised crime groups and terrorist groups constantly try to create a vision of reality that isn't the case? They're trying to pull the wool over our eyes. They're trying to use coercion through fear to, or fear of say from the Western point of view, fear of terrorism to make us do certain things. Okay, so it's technology is being driven, and of course, the elite that's based on on military and oil industry is on the wane, and new technologies and new elites will competing elites will um, obviously come to the fore. We've seen this with the power of the computers, although the computing firms, although they are more benign. In the past, it was much more insidious. Such groups that were based around the psychoanalysis, right, which got people such as industry to believe in built-in redundancy of goods. So you would buy a good, and 5 years later, every 5 years, every time you bought it, it would fail. Okay, so there are, and that of course goes back to Freud. Okay, and then there were the banking industrial elites. Okay, who, when you look at the Russian mafia, how the Russian mafia has become legitimized through the media, through its role in Russian banking. It's gone through the same process as these industrial banking elites, which were based around J.P. Morgan, Chase Bank, which is from the Rockefellers and the Rothschilds, in Standard Oil, for instance. those people came from a system that was akin to organised crime, but then they began to legitimise themselves into mainstream business, and they were rewarded for that legitimisation. So the problem remains. Um, for for us in the West, Bin Laden is a terrorist, but in the Middle East, Bin Laden is the head of a banking and construction elite family. Okay, and just like the Saudi royal family and the Hashemites in Jordan, these long processes go back deep into history, into the 19th century, where people like Churchill got the link between Britain and Saudi Arabia for Saudi oil. Okay, now once you start naming names, it starts becoming very um, controversial. But this can be all read in history, in mainstream history books. Okay, now if it wasn't for oil technology, Bin Laden and his family and the Saudis and the Hashemites in Jordan will probably still be riding around in camels and chopping each other's heads off. And in 100 years, they might well be doing that again, because solar power and other technologies, clean energy, being developed by the European Union. Okay, the United States is doing something as well. Might change the nature of who is in charge. Okay, and that will then filter in to a change in the political culture. Okay, but let's not focus just on that. Okay, it was the problem and the tension between written constitution and political conventions, power conventions, steering groups, organised crime and terrorism on the other hand, okay, is our desire to be free and to live in equality and fairness with each other, okay, and their desire to change our reality, okay. Now, you might, having said that, how do we change that? Well, we have to have a cultural an educational change in our system to teach people about logic, okay, and and philosophy that is based around society, teamwork, okay, and concern for society. Because Thatcherism in the UK and Reagan was backed up by powerful forces, okay, in the background in business and other things that have taught us to live in an atomistic society, that society and the nation does not exist. Okay, now this is both extremely right wing and extremely for globalization. Now, I'm not an extreme nationalist. I'm a culturally English nationalist. I like English culture. Okay, I like everybody in England to be culturally English, but I believe the European Union is a middle way between nationalism and globalisation, in that it's a confederation of countries that act like an international organisation, but it has a president and a central bank. But I believe the central bank should be based on currency should be based on the economic output of the people, that we actually make things, that we actually export things, that we actually, when we import things, we pay for it with money that's based on an index of goods, such as the CPI, but which will include gold and house prices and food and other things. So it's a real a real marker of the economy. Okay. Also, how do we de-radicalise some of these steering groups? Well, you have to make them more open and more accountable. You can't ban them, because they're backed up by people who are just basically too powerful to take on. Okay, but we can democratise throughout, and we need to be an armed democracy, that not with weapons but with conceptions about reality that fit reality. Okay, that the army is trained in both counter-espionage and counter-terrorism and counter-insurgency and conventional warfare. That is the main thing, and that the university system works together to prevent undemocratic forces destroying society.